Excuse me, the Canadian people are not obliged, 41 million people are not obliged to wait around while this party sorts out its shit. There's the bad news and the good news. The bad news is that people feel like they've done absolutely everything right and their lives are trapped.
As you move from, as you shifted your position up the political hierarchy and are poised really likely to take the reins in Canada at some point in the next year, you've listened to all these people. And so what have you learned? And what has it made you convinced of, let's say?
Well, first of all, there's the bad news and the good news. The bad news is that people feel like they've done absolutely everything right and their lives are trapped. Young people say, look, okay, I went through, I got an education, I work nonstop, and I have made the calculation that there is no mathematical path for me to own a house. Mm-hmm. It's just not possible. In Toronto here, for example, if you take the average income and the average house price, it would take you 29 years to save up for a down payment. So, if you're
for a down
payment, not to pay it off, forget paying it off. And so if you're a young woman who's got a biological clock, obviously, well, do the math. You start off at, let's say you're 25. Well, you're going to be in your 50s before you can afford the average house. Then there's the kind of middle-aged people who do have kids already, and they're terrified of the dangers in the streets. I mean, our streets are just being overtaken by drugs and gangsterism and other dangers, and they want safety again. And then you have business owners that are saying there's just no way to continue to compete in Canada. We have to look at moving, and that means the next 200 jobs we create is going to be in Ohio or Florida or some other place than Canada.
So there's definitely an opportunity there, and clearly your political party and you are capitalizing on that you have the support from young people increasingly right across Canada.
We are winning among youth. In fact, the youth were the first to come on board with me. My rallies were overwhelmingly populated with youth, which is not normal for conservatives.
Right.
And the reason is because in your youth, of course, you as you write it, young people want to have the adventure of their lives. They want to go into the wilderness and earn a living and bring it home and raise kids and have a purpose. And so now young people and I love this. This is great news. Our young people are saying, I want to start a business. I want to invent something. I want to create things. I want to become a tradesman. And then when I get good enough at that, I want to hire 5 other tradesmen. And by the time I retire, I want to have 300 employees. And then I want to give that company to my kids. These are the stories that I hear when I go out and about in Canada. And the great news is we can have all those things. Mm-hmm. That's the optimistic message that I have for people. But we've got a limitless supply of resources here. We're like a cornucopia. The third biggest supply of oil, 5th biggest supply of natural gas, biggest supply of uranium, 5th biggest supply of lithium. We've got not 1, not 2, not 3, but 4 coasts to tidewater.
Right.
We live next to the biggest military and economic superpower the world has ever seen. We have a highly educated population and the best system of government in the history of the world, the parliamentary system. Not the best government, but the best system of government. So all these massive advantages, we just need to unleash that potential.
Per capita, in terms of GDP per person, gross domestic product per person, so that's total productivity, is Ontario. And Ontario inhabitants are now poorer per capita than inhabitants of Mississippi, and that's the poorest American state. So the inhabitants of Canada's richest province are poorer than the inhabitants of the United States' poorest state, and that's actually occurred primarily in the last 10 years.
Yes.
And because we were basically at parity before that.
Yes.
And had historically been not quite as rich as the Americans, with some blips above them, but pretty much tracking them 1-to-1.
Yeah.
And now it's 60%, something like that. And that's not all the bad news, because it's 60% in terms of absolute wealth. Now,
it's really bad. It's really incredible. Like 10 years ago, the New York Times wrote an article, welcome to Canada, we're home of the world's most affluent middle class. And in that article, the Times had calculated that median American and Canadian incomes were tied, and that Canadians were slightly better off Now, part of that was because of the 08-09 financial crisis hit them harder than it hit us. But still, now per capita GDP in the States is $22,000 higher than in Canada, measured in USD. So that's about almost 30,000 measured in.
Right. So that's a whole other income, essentially.
Yes.
That's a whole other part-time income.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then, as you correctly point out, their real estate is significantly cheaper than ours. So their dollars go a lot further, even when you match up the exchange rates. And what's worse than that is that the leading indicators are even more horrific. And leading indicators, for example, are investment dollars, because your wealth tomorrow is determined by your investment today. If you take business investment and divide it by the number of workers, the American worker gets $28,000 of investment measured in US dollars.
This is per capita?
Per worker.
Or per year?
Per worker, per member of the labor force.
Okay.
So you take the total business investment of the United States divided by the total number of workers in America, it's 28 grand. In Canada, it's 15 grand. So the Canadian worker gets about 55 cents for every dollar of his American, and they're both measured in USD. So our productivity is another major problem. Like right now, and that's productivity sounds complicated. It's actually extremely simple. You just take the GDP and you divide it by the hours worked in the country. So American GDP is $80. So for every hour an American worker works, on average, he or she produces $80 of GDP. In Canada, it's 50. So that's every hour. So that means we have to work 60% more just to make the same amount and have the same level of income to buy food and housing.
The scuttlebutt in the Canadian press is that Singh is propping up the government for personal reasons, say, regarding his pension. Now, you're making a much more political case. But what I can't understand how he can reconcile himself to himself, because what he does is so at odds with what he says that it couldn't be more different. I want to talk about two things. What you think is going to unfold, well, even in January, I mean, once Parliament reconvenes, and what you expect from Trudeau in terms of his political action, then what you expect as the Liberal Party tries to reformulate itself. Like, I can't imagine a scenario, not really, where Trudeau leads the Liberals into the next election. That seems to me highly improbable. It wouldn't surprise me if he has to be removed kicking and screaming, so to speak. But I'd like to hear your thoughts on what are Canadians to expect in the upcoming months.
So Parliament's back in late January. It will take some weeks to actually get a non-confidence vote onto the floor of the House of Commons. Then we'll see if Jagmeet Singh's latest promise of voting non-confidence was as insincere as his prior commitments to that effect.
When does his pension kick in?
In February. So he's now, basically, he said yesterday that he would put forward a non-confidence motion at the earliest opportunity. Well, that's likely to be March, which is...
Oh, that's convenient. Okay,
right
so that problem's off. So really,
that's right.
So March is the earliest, as far as you can see, that election could be called.
Singh will not vote non-confidence before he gets his pension, or at least he will not vote non-confidence in a way that sees the election happen before his pension kicks in. So we won't have an election before very late winter, early spring. Then there's the possibility that the Trudeau resigns and then goes to the Governor General and says we need to shut down Parliament, while the Liberal Party then chooses a new replacement, a Trudeau 2.0. And so there would be a leadership race. God knows how long that would drag on for.
You think approximately in March, no earlier than March, as far as you can foresee?
Yeah, probably. And during which time we'd continue to flounder and twist in the wind. And by the way, the Liberal media is all saying, well, surely you wouldn't want to trigger an election during a Liberal leadership race. Excuse me, the Canadian people are not obliged, 41 million people are not obliged to wait around while this party sorts out its shit. Like, these guys could have got rid of Trudeau a year and a half ago. They knew he was a disaster then. And now they say, well, we're low in the polls, so we have to get rid of him. Now, you didn't care when he was just depriving single mothers of food for their kids, or doubling housing costs, or unleashing crime in neighborhoods across the country. But now you're really concerned about getting rid of him because your poll numbers are down and you want to keep your job. Sorry, that's not a good reason to paralyze the entire country, in the face, by the way, of a major negotiation with the incoming U.S. president, who enters with a massive and powerful mandate, and a man who has proven that he can spot weakness from a mile away. So the country should not be forced to wait for the Liberal Party to clean up its own mess. They've had plenty of time to do that. What we need now is certainty, and the only way that can come is through an election so the people can decide.